Well, good afternoon and welcome to Guildhall Library. I must say it's a great pleasure to be here today to talk to you about Shakespeare, London, and the First Folio. My name is Jonathan Wover. I'm a City of London guide, also a Clerkenwell and Islington guide. And I'm going to try and run through in about an hour or so how Shakespeare and the City of London left their marks on each other and how they influenced each other. And my perspective is very much from the point of view of a tour guide, someone who leads tours in the streets of London under the name London on the Ground. Now, I don't want to throw too many Shakespeare quotes at you, but I do want to start with this one. This is from Macbeth. Life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage, and then is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. And as I say, that's from Macbeth, and Macbeth in rather gloomy mood. And he's making a comment rather denigrating life itself, but also you could argue he's denigrating what it is to be a player or an actor or a person of the theatre. Shakespeare himself, of course, was an actor and very much a person of the theatre, but I think he had a lot more than just his hour upon the stage. More than 400 years later, the 400th anniversary of the publication of his first collection of his plays from 1623, of course, we're marking this year. Okay, so this is my contents page. Like a good Shakespearean play, I'm going to have 5 acts as well as a prologue and an epilogue. So first of all, how Shakespeare maybe got to London, and then a quick timeline to make sure we're all on the same page. The playhouses that he used or that are closely associated with him, the places that we know he lived in London, the places that were important to the First Folio publication, Act 5, Shakespeare's image, a bit about that, where we can see that around London, and other Shakespeare locations. And London, as far as I'm concerned for this talk, is really the area of London that existed in Shakespeare's day. I'm not going to go really beyond that. Okay, so our prologue, how did Shakespeare get to London? Well, nobody knows. Nobody knows at all. But as a young man, he came from his hometown, Stratford-upon-Avon, something like 95 to 100 miles northwest of London. Now, he probably would have walked here. He probably would have walked. And there were 2 principal routes he might have taken. One was via Banbury and Aylesbury, the other way via Oxford. But either way, he would have ended up approaching London via Uxbridge. Both those 2 routes converged at Uxbridge, and approaching London from the west. Now, if we look at this map, this is the early modern map of London, also known as the Agas map, also known as the woodcut map, and it depicts London in around 1561. The images I've used on these slides, by the way, they come from the early map, the map of early modern London from the University of Victoria, who digitally scanned the map that they took from that they borrowed from the London Metropolitan Archives, and created this wonderful, detailed, zoomable images on their website. So it would approach from the west along that blue line that I've mapped out there, and entered the city walls, almost certainly at Aldgate, and then soon made his way straight onto Cheapside, the main street of London. So if we zoom in on this map a little bit further, the western edge of the early modern map of London, you can see those rural road that's coming in from the west. It actually says the way to Uxbridge. So he would have been walking along through the fields, past the hamlet and church of St. Giles in the Fields. And of course, his approach from the west would have taken him past what was then the gallows at Tyburn. It's now the western end of Oxford Street. So anyway, past St. Giles in the Fields, through more streets, through more fields, excuse me, and then into the area that we still call Holborn. Few more houses on the side of the road here, but still fields either side. Past the Bishop of Ely's palace, where the bishops of Ely had their London residence, where, of course, referred to a couple of times in Shakespeare's plays. And then past the Church of St. Andrew's, Holborn, over the River Fleet, which then was still openly flowing. It's now under Farringdon Road, so across the little bridge, and then entered the city via Newgate, or as it says on the map here, Newgat. Now, entering through Newgate, he would have had Christchurch Greyfriars, the former Greyfriars Monastery to his left, and looking over the houses to his right, he would have seen the looming tower of St. Paul's Cathedral dominating the sky to his right. And pretty quickly, he would continue and arrive in Cheapside. Cheapside, the great high street, the commercial centre of the city of London, as in many ways it still is to this day, and it was from Roman times when the Romans started London. Cheapside, by the way, is from the meaning of it is from an Old English word meaning a shop or a market. Now he's arriving in Cheapside with its conduit, with the cross dedicated to the wife of King Edward I, Queen Eleanor, and the many shops, the many houses, the many traders, the many inns, the many smithies, all kinds of human life, hawkers. There would have been crowds everywhere, a very bustling, vibrant city. And where there are crowds, there are beggars, there are criminals, there are pickpockets, there are prostitutes, there are pimps, but also the streets of London filled with animals of all kinds. There would have been horses, of course, but also cows and sheep and probably goats and chickens and dogs and cats and rats, of course, and all the mess that all these creatures are creating. So a very vibrant, bustling place. And it's a place that would have, I'm sure, filled Shakespeare with awe. It was nothing like the rural, rather quiet town of Stratford-upon-Avon where he came from. But it was a place which provided opportunity for someone who had something about them, maybe a bit of entrepreneurial spirit, someone who's prepared to work hard, and someone with quite a lot of luck. It was a place that really offered opportunity. And it was a place that was going through a huge population growth at this point. In the middle of the 1500s, the population of the London area was around 100,000. By around 1605 or so, it would have been more than 220,000. Okay, so looking at another view of London at a similar time, we have Fisher's view. This is from 1616. So whereas the early modern map is from around about the time of Shakespeare's birth, a little bit earlier, this one, 1616, is actually the year of Shakespeare's death. Okay, so Fisher view of London 1616, and we can see St. Paul's dominating the skyline just to the left of centre, London Bridge, the only bridge across the river for many hundreds of years, the river itself teeming with boats. And we can see, if we look in a bit more closely, we can see across the river there, all those church spires, teeming with church spires. And almost at the centre, you can see Guildhall is marked, that does say Guildhall, towards the left of the centre there. So if we zoom in today, oops, there's Guildhall. Zoom in today, we can still see that very same building. It's just outside here. We're right opposite Guildhall Yard from that building. This building, essentially, Guildhall, is from the 1400s. It was here when Shakespeare was here. The porch in the middle is a bit more of a modern addition. It was added in the late 18th century. But those rough stone walls that look a bit like a church or a cathedral are 600 years old. It's the town hall for the City of London. It was, and still is, really at the heart of civic life in the City of London. And of course, in those days, the City of London really was all of London. It's the place where Lord Mayors are and were chosen. It's the place where the Court of Common Council, all the elected representatives of the citizenry of London met and still meet from the point of view of the City of London to this day. And of course, the City of London was built very much on a mercantile commercial tradition. Merchants who were members of the various guilds or livery companies of the City of London were right at the heart of the development of London as a thriving centre. And it was the full members of those livery companies or trade guilds that got to vote in elections and participate in the municipal life to the fullest. So it was very much at the centre of London. And it was also a place that had been the venue for show trials in the 1500s and the early 1600s, while Shakespeare was here and before he came. So at the centre of national life in many ways. The first big show trial that took place in Guildhall, 1553, was the trial of Lady Jane Grey, the 9-day Queen. This was some decades before Shakespeare arrived, but that was the backdrop for this building, which he would have arrived to. During Shakespeare's time in London, excuse me, the trial of a man called Roderigo Lopez in 1594 was held in Guildhall,
Rodrigo Lopez was a physician to Queen Elizabeth I, accused of attempting to poison her, and tried for that and convicted for that. He was actually a Jewish refugee from Portugal, and this stirred up a lot of anti-Semitic sentiment in London at the time. And it's thought that Shakespeare, when writing The Merchant of Venice, the trial of Shylock in that play, he may have taken elements of that from the trial of Rodrigo Lopez at Guildhall. Also in Shakespeare's time in London, Father Henry Garnet, I always want to say Alf Garnet, Father Henry Garnet, who was a Catholic priest implicated in the Gunpowder Plot, the plot to destroy Parliament and King James I in 1606. He was tried here at Guildhall. So this real life dramas were taking place in this building. And I'm of no doubt whatsoever that these kind of events and the teeming mercantile life of the City of London, which is based on Guildhall, influenced Shakespeare in his plays. He didn't actually base, apart from his history plays, many of which, all of which, one way or another, have London as a scene, he didn't really base any of his other plays in London. But the Italian cities and the other cities of Europe which he based plays in certainly took elements of the London that he knew, because he almost certainly didn't go to all those European cities himself. Now, he mentions Guildhall a couple of times in his plays. He mentions it in Richard III, when Richard, when he's still Gloucester, he sends Buckingham to Guildhall to assess support or otherwise amongst the citizenry and the mayor to support his candidacy, as it were, to become king. He also mentions Guildhall. Shakespeare mentions Guildhall in Henry VI, Part 2. Jack Cade Rebellion, which is a true life rebellion, taking place in the 15th century. Jack Cade comes to London as a rebel, takes over and tries the Lord High Treasurer at the Guildhall in a sham sort of trial. So Shakespeare was using this building to inspire him very much. It's also worth mentioning that the first banquet that probably took place at Guildhall in real life in 1420 was the Lord Mayor, certain Richard Whittington, who's quite an appropriate name at this time of year, was hosting King Henry V 5 years after the Battle of Agincourt. And of course, Henry V was the subject of one of Shakespeare's history plays. And there's a reference in Henry V to the mayor and his brethren in London, the mayor and his brethren in best sort welcoming the king like ancient Rome and a conquering Caesar. And so there was often this parallel drawn between London and ancient Rome. And unbeknown to Shakespeare at the time, right underneath Guildhall is the remains of a Roman amphitheatre. Shakespeare wouldn't have known that, but he would have known, as everybody did, that London was originally founded by the Romans. So these kind of parallels between Rome and London were often drawn in Shakespeare's plays. Just to sort of conclude before I move on this section, the London that Shakespeare came to, the population is growing rapidly as people are coming here, and people are coming here, as they do today, to find opportunity, because at that time there were huge developments in all fields of human endeavor. So the arts, literature, music, science, astronomy, exploration, trade and commerce, all of these things, there was huge progress taking place, and London was the place to participate. And these are all themes which we do hear about in Shakespeare's plays. Okay, I'm going to move. Before I move on from Guildhall Yard, we've got a nice bust of Shakespeare by Tim Crawley, which is outside Guildhall Art Gallery. So, you know, he took inspiration from the central part of the City of London, and 400 years later, there he is. He's left his mark very clearly in Guildhall Yard. So moving on to, just to get a quick timeline, as I said earlier on, we don't know a lot actually about Shakespeare, but just try to do a quick summary of some of the facts so that we're all on the same page. So he was born in 1564 in Stratford-on-Avon to his father, John Shakespeare, mother, Mary Arden. His father was a glover by trade. He was an alderman in Stratford, became for a year bailiff, which is equivalent to being the mayor of Stratford. So a well-respected merchant and citizen. However, John Shakespeare also got involved in some dodgy activities. He was fined for usury, which is basically lending money at a rate of interest which wasn't allowed. And he was, also fined for being involved in trading in wool. He wasn't a member of the wool makers or the wool sellers guild, so he shouldn't have been doing that. He was naughty. So he kind of fell from grace a little bit. Mother of Shakespeare, Mary Arden, was a member of a fairly prominent family in that region. So I've put a little P here as well. A little P against the year as I go through this timeline indicates there were outbreaks of the plague, bubonic plague. We tend to think of the Great Plague in London in 1665 and the Black Death in the 14th century, but plague was very common for many, many years. There'd been a big plague outbreak in 1563 in London, and it spread around the country, and it got to Stratford by 1564. Luckily, the infant William was not afflicted by it. So the next thing that we know as a fact about Shakespeare is 1583. So we're talking about 19 years on. His daughter Susanna was born 5 months after he married his wife Anne Hathaway. Okay, so the next thing we know is he married Anne Hathaway. 5 months after that, he had a daughter. So then 1585, his family is complete. His twins Hamnet with an N, and Judith were born and baptized in Stratford. And that is basically all we know as actual fact about Shakespeare's early life. He was probably educated at the local grammar school, but we don't have any actual factual record of that. You go to the grammar school there today and they say that's where he went, but nobody can actually prove it. 1592, by 1592, 7 years later, there is a reference to him in London having had several plays produced. And this is thanks to a man called Robert Greene, who posthumously published a pamphlet called Greene's Groatsworth of Wit, where he basically refers to this unnamed man, but we know he's talking about Shakespeare, refers to him as an upstart crow. He didn't go to one of the ancient universities, unlike Greene, and therefore he had no right to be writing all these plays and being successful, unlike Greene, who was also a playwright, but not quite as successful. So this is a reference to him 7 years after that birth of his twins. And the 7 years in between, known as the lost years, no one really knows. There's also all kinds of conjecture and speculation, which I'm not going to go into now because we haven't got time. But it was another plague year, 1592, and that lasted until 1594. There was sort of plague in bursts on and off. Theatres were opened and closed quite a lot of the time, opened a bit. Sound a bit familiar from recent times. And during that period in 1593 and 94, Shakespeare's two big long poems, Venus and Adonis and The Rape of Lucrece, were published. I guess that was a good thing to be doing while the theatres were closed. But also when the theatre started to open again in 1594, the Chamberlain's Men, this is the first troupe of actors with which we can concretely associate Shakespeare. It's formed in 1594 at the Theatre in Shoreditch. About more on that later, under the patronage of the Lord Chamberlain. So by 1596, we know he's living in the parish of St. Helens, Bishopsgate, not far from today's Liverpool Street Station. And in 1596, also tragically, his son Hamnet died, aged only 11. Following year, in 1597, we know Shakespeare bought the second biggest house in Stratford called New Place. 1599, the Globe Theatre on the South Bank is built, and we know that he was living in the Liberty of the Clink around that area on the South Bank at that time as well. 1603, another plague year. King James takes over from Queen Elizabeth because she's died, and immediately gives royal patronage to what had been the Chamberlain's Men, they're now the King's Men. And in 1604, when the coronation procession actually takes place, because the year that King James took over, there was plague, they couldn't have the procession. Shakespeare is named the first name in the list of the players of the King's Men. So he's really arrived at the top of the list. 1604, also, we know he was living in Silver Street, not far from here. 1608, the King's Men started to use the Blackfriars Theatre. 1609, another plague year, his sonnets were published. They were probably written quite a long time earlier, but they were published in 1609. 1613, he bought the former gatehouse of the Blackfriars Priory. More about that later too. And then in 1616, he died in Stratford-on-Avon, having really been retired for the last few years. And then final date, 1623, 400 years ago this year, the first folio, first collection of his plays was published. And there's a quick picture of it, just to remind you of the reason that's prompted me to come and talk to you today. That's, I shouldn't say this, it was at Guildhall Library. That's the copy of the first folio that you can see in the British Library. The Guildhall Library has its own copy. It's on display right across Guildhall Yard currently in the Guildhall Art Gallery. So if you haven't seen it yet, you can go over there and see it. I urge you to. There's a facsimile copy at the back of the room, whilst the real one is in the Guildhall Art Gallery. Okay, so moving on to the main playhouses, the four main playhouses that we know were associated with the Chamberlain's men and then the King's men. There were lots of playhouses around Elizabethan and Jacobean London, so I'm not going to talk about all of them. I'm just going to talk about the four main ones for this company. So the very first one, the Theatre, just called the Theatre, which was built in 1577 in Shoreditch, north of the city walls in a slightly more rural area built on the former Holywell Priory site. And it was built by a man called James Burbage. And James Burbage was a bit of a jack of all trades. He was actually a carpenter turned actor manager. So he thought, well, I've got this troupe of actors working with me, I'll build a theatre for them. Being a carpenter, that was quite handy. And the theatre he built was, we don't actually really know exactly what it looked like, just like most of the theatres at that time, but it probably was one of these outdoor arena type theatres where you've got the central area, which has a stage thrusting into a yard. Most of the people watching are standing in the yard, and then there are galleries undercover around the outside of the arena, which is slightly more expensive. That's the basic format of these theatres. This depiction of the view of the City of London from the north in 1597 shows what probably is the theatre there. It's circled there. How did Shakespeare get involved in it? We know for certain that the Chamberlain's men were formed in 1594 and Shakespeare was a part of it. The chances are that he was involved, intermittently with other theatre companies before then, but it was only after the plague period of 1592 to 94 these guys formed as the Chamberlain's men that we really know where Shakespeare was. And how did he get involved? Well, no one actually knows. There is a good story that he came, whenever it was that he came to London, that his first involvement with theatre was looking after the horses of gentlemen who were at the theatre. So they would have ridden out to Shoreditch, for example, on their horse, and someone needs to look after their horse. And Shakespeare started doing that as a young man, got very good at it, had to employ a team of other young guys to help out. And he's hanging around outside theatres. He gets talking to the actors. They think, oh, he's got something about him. He gets involved. He starts helping out with all the backstage work and gradually works his way up and into the theatre. Certainly by 1594, we know he's established as the main playwright of the Chamberlain's men. James Burbage ran into trouble with the landlord. The lease was a 20-year lease from 1577 to 97. They owned the building of the theatre, but they didn't own the ground. And basically, cutting a long story short, because of this dispute with the landlord, they went and they stopped acting there for a while. And then in December 1598, under cover of night, they instructed a carpenter called Peter Street with 12 helpers to take down the theatre and transport it eventually to the other side of the river. More about that in a moment. But while they were in dispute with the landlord and before they took down the theatre, they started to use, this is the site today, Ash, before I move on. This is the site today, and there's a new bronze statue of someone surveying the scene of where that theatre used to be, a little street called New Inn Broadway. So yes, so the other theatre that's in Shoreditch is called the Curtain, or was called the Curtain. So this was used in the 1590s as sort of overspill by the Chamberlain's men for a while. And then when they got into dispute with the landlord at the theatre, they used this from 1597 to 98 before they left Shoreditch entirely. So the scene today on Curtain Road, not far from Old Street, you've got this old pub called the Horse and Groom, the only of one of three buildings surviving, because recently there's been a huge new development, tower blocks, residential and offices built around that site. And if you go the other side of that little row of pubs, you can see on the other side they've got this new sort of metal box building, which is going to be, it's called the Pavilion. It's going to be a sort of visitor centre, and underneath it are some of the remains of the Curtain Theatre, which you'll be able to visit. It's not yet complete, but it will be soon, I'm told. So then, yes, moving to the south of the river, as I said, December 1598, dispute with the landlord. They took down the timbers of the theatre. Peter Street, the carpenter, stored them at his yard in near the Bridewell, just on the other side of the river, kind of over there somewhere, would have been the Bridewell, somewhere around there. And then by summer of 1599, because obviously you're not going to start building a new theatre in the middle of winter, by summer of 1599, the Globe was open. Now, this view, which is from Holler's long view of London 1647, so some years later, Holler actually got the two buildings that you can see in the middle distance the wrong way around. He's labelled the one on the right as the Globe. That's actually the bear baiting arena, and he's labelled the Globe as the bear baiting. So the one that's circled is where the Globe was. This, by the way, is the second Globe. The first Globe burnt down in 1613 during a performance of Henry VIII, the play co-written by Shakespeare and John Fletcher. And as far as we know, no one was injured, but one man's trousers caught on fire and had to be put out by a bottle of ale being thrown on him. So the second Globe Theatre was built in 1613 and lasted until the Puritan Parliament closed it all down in the 1640s. So yeah, the Globe Theatre was like the theatre in Shoreditch, but actually bigger, probably housing 2,500 to 3,000 people. The groundlings who stood in the centre would have paid a penny. If you wanted a seat in one of the galleries, that would have been twopence. And if you wanted a cushion as well as your seat, that would have been threepence. So that was the price of things in those days. So that if you go to that location today, Park Street, used to be called Maid Lane, but Park Street, there's a housing development and there's a plaque commemorating the fact that the Globe used to be there. So it's not the location of what we now call Shakespeare's Globe. It's close to, but not the same location. So Shakespeare's Globe, which is a reconstruction, conjectural reconstruction, because we don't actually have plans of the original Globe, opened in 1997. And the first play performed there was Henry V, with its prologue referring to this wooden O, so quite an appropriate one to open with, and is one of the most prominent examples of Shakespeare's legacy in London today, where you can go and experience what it would have been like to be one of those groundlings standing, although you probably have to pay more than a penny these days. So this picture I'm showing you here, Shakespeare's Globe as now seen from the city end of the Millennium Bridge. So the northern end of the Millennium Bridge, you can just see the Millennium Bridge structure on the right-hand side of the picture here. And there's the Globe. And then the picture below it is from the Fisher view of 1616. So looking the other way from the south, and there's the Globe there. So similar looking structures. Obviously, as I said, we don't have plans for it, but we have similar looking structures. But the thing that I always find really amazing is you can just see, let me move it on. I've highlighted these. You can just see Southwark Cathedral. It used to be called St. Mary Overy. It's there at the bottom of the Shard. It's a rather blurred, rather bad photograph. Apologies for that. But you can just see the tower of St. Mary Overy, Southwark Cathedral there. And here in the Fisher view, you can see it. So the church, the scale is probably a bit exaggerated in the Fisher view, but the church completely dominated the skyline of Bankside, and the theatres and bear baiting arenas and other entertainment buildings, were very prominent. Today, Shakespeare's Globe reproduction just is lost in all the massive buildings that surround it. Okay, so moving on then to the fourth theatre with which we associate very strongly the troupe of actors that Shakespeare was a member of. It's a Blackfriars. So Blackfriars, the former monastery closed down by King Henry VIII, with all the other monasteries in the 1540s, sparkling off a massive period of property development, repurposing of buildings, tearing down of buildings, erection of new buildings, all kinds of things went on. And in 1596, James Burbage bought one of the prominent buildings of the Blackfriars area, which had been one of the monastery buildings, known as the Parliament Hall, and he built inside that building the first purpose-built indoor theatre anywhere in London. And we call it the second Blackfriars Theatre because there'd been another Blackfriars Theatre in the 1570s and 80s in another building somewhere in the Blackfriars complex, which had been used by choir boys, the children of the Chapel Royal. So boys who sang in the choir at court, they used the first Blackfriars Theatre to put on plays as well. So Burbage buys the Parliament Hall, puts this new theatre in there, 1596, spends a lot of money on it, and it would have had probably seating for 600 to maybe maximum of 1,000 people, 2 galleries inside, and it's undercover. So it's a different kind of theatre entirely. But the local population who lived in that area, the rather well-to-do local population, they didn't want this sort of person in their area. these ruffian actor types were not welcome in this area. Acting and theatre was seen as rather a down market activity, attracting, you know, a rabble in terms of crowd. So they petitioned the Privy Council to forbid the use of the theatre by these actors, and the Privy Council said, "Yep, we're not having this." So Burbage and his men were not allowed to use it. So, but he bought it and spent a lot of money on it. So he actually leased it out to a man called Henry Evans, who used it again for choir boy actors. And the local population did not object to the choir boy actors because they were of a better background and brought in a higher class of clientele. So there was no problem with that happening. And this theatre, being indoors and a smaller venue, it sort of changed the nature of theatre productions compared to these bigger outdoor arenas. So you could have, excuse me, you had to light the inside of it because it was inside. You had to have candles to light it. Candles, of course, burn down after a while, so you have to have an interval so that you can put new candles. And during the interval, you've got to keep people entertained, so you play music. So, you know, all these new developments having intervals, having interval music. You could also fly in actors and props and scenery in a way that you couldn't do in the big outdoor theatres. And the way that you'd write a play would be slightly different. You're writing for a more intimate setting, whereas in the big outdoor theatres, it's much more sort of declaiming and sort of big gestures. So more intimate style of scene could be written for these indoor theatres. Now, these choir boys continued from 1596 till 1608, and it became quite a hotbed of new talent. People like Ben Jonson and Thomas Middleton, well-known Jacobean playwrights, you know, sort of got their names whilst writing for this Blackfriars Theatre. But 1608, they put on a play, these choir boys, which upset the French ambassador in some unknown way. And so King James shut it down and gave it back to James Burbage. So actually, sorry, Richard Burbage. James Burbage by this time has died. His son, his two sons, Richard and Cuthbert Burbage, were now sort of in charge. And so 1608, finally, the King's men, as they are now, they get to use the Blackfriars Theatre, and they used it as a year-round venue. The outdoor theatre at the Globe was really best for the summer, whereas this could be used all year round. And although it was smaller, because they could charge a higher price, it was more profitable. And Shakespeare made his money by being a sharer in the box office. He didn't really make money out of being a playwright or an actor, but by sharing in the box office, that's what really brought the money in for Shakespeare. Okay, so those were the four main theatres. Now I just want to whiz through the London homes. Checking on the time, good. He lived in London for 25 plus years probably, but we know very little about where he actually lived. We know that he lived in 1596. He may have been in London for 10 years already, we don't know. But we know that he lived in the parish of St. Helens, Bishopsgate. And this is going back to the Agas map, the woodcut map, the map of early modern London. And it's showing you a close-up of the area. The church of St. Helens, Bishopsgate is circled, and its churchyard. You can see in the churchyard it says S. Ellen, St. Helens. The church looks pretty much the same today as when Shakespeare would have lived in the area. He would have attended that church as a parish church. And it's recently been suggested that he most likely was lodging in a building that was owned by the company of leather sellers who have a hall in the area. And that building he lived in was probably where that office building on the left hand of the side of this picture is today. And it's kind of coincidental that that modern building has projecting oriel windows, which might not have been out of place, windows projecting like that in Shakespeare's day. He almost certainly, though, would have looked out from his home and seen pretty much the same facade of that church as you can see today. By 1599, possibly a bit earlier, we know from tax records, by the way, where he lived in St. Helens and also the Liberty of the Clink, which was the area around the Globe Theatre. So I've just shown you here images of that part of London from the 1561 map and from the Fisher Panorama of 1616. In the first one, the Globe has not yet been built, but there are other arenas in the area which look similar. And in the second one, you can see the Globe is marked in the picture there. So he lived in the Liberty of the Clink, 1599. In 1604, or possibly a bit earlier, and possibly for 2 or 3 years around that time, he lived on the corner of Silver Street and Muggle Street. just a short distance from here, just kind of round the corner that way. You can actually see here's Guildhall. So we're the building we're in now is about there. So this where he was living was just there. So I've circled the house. It's maybe not the same house from 1561 to 1604, but that's where the location of the house would have been, this double-gabled house. And if you look at the scene today, it looks like that. There was a church of St. Olav, Silver Street, opposite where the Shakespeare residence or the lodgings were. That church was destroyed in the Great Fire of London of 1666 and never rebuilt. So there's a little park there, just on the dual carriageway of London Wall. And to the right of the picture, you can just see part of the Richard Rogers designed office building that stands there now. I reckon the house that Shakespeare lived in was probably where the air intakes are for the Richard Rogers building. So this would have been Silver Street running along here, and Muggle Street would have gone across the dual carriageway towards Barbican in that direction. So I reckon somewhere around there was where. And he wrote Othello, Measure for Measure, All's Well That Ends Well, various other plays from those air intakes, I reckon. And there's a blue plaque in the park, which I've reproduced on the slide there as well, telling us that he had lodgings in that area at the house of Christopher and Mary Mountjoy. They were actually Huguenots, so French Protestants, and their names would have actually been Christophe and Marie Montjoie, but these have been anglicised in the little sign there. And the reason that we know he lived there was because some years later there was a court case brought by the apprentice of Christophe and Marie Montjoie against them, and Shakespeare was called as a witness. So the Montjoie family, they were tyre makers. Now, this has got nothing to do with Michelin or Goodyear. Tyre makers were people who made ornamental decorative headdresses for upper class ladies, and it was a form of attire. That's why it was called tyre makers. And in fact, they were very good at it. They were supplying these headdresses to Anne, the Queen, the wife of King James. And their apprentice, a man called Stephen Bellott, who lived with them, as was normal for apprentices, he became engaged to their daughter, Mary. And Shakespeare actually was involved in their sort of engagement, if you like, because so he must have been more than just a lodger. He must have been a friend of theirs as well. Just trying to find the expression. They were made sure by William Shakespeare, giving each other's hand to the hand. We know this from the records of the court case at which Shakespeare was called as a witness. And the court case was because Stephen Bellott said that the parents didn't provide the dowry of £60 that they promised when he married their daughter. He still married her, but he brought a case saying you didn't cough up, basically. And the court basically said, oh, right, okay, this is a tricky one. Let's refer it to the French court. So there was another court which dealt with cases for French people. And then we don't know what happened at that court. Anyway, so Shakespeare lived there probably for a few years. It's also an interesting little side story here that in the parish records for St. Olav, Silver Street, in 1605, a local family, the Taylor family, had a daughter whom they baptized with the name of Cordelia. Now, Cordelia, for many of you, I'm sure, rings a bell as being a fairly important character in the play King Lear, which Shakespeare wrote while he was lodging in Silver Street. However, the name Cordelia was not a common name in those days, so it does raise the rather intriguing prospect. We don't know the answer to the question, but did Shakespeare hear the name Cordelia from this couple that were having a baby? Because the play King Lear was performed after this baptism. So they hadn't seen the play. They couldn't have seen the play when they decided to call their daughter Cordelia. So maybe they heard the name from somewhere and they were chatting with their local friend, William Shakespeare, one day and said, oh, if we have a girl, we're going to call her Cordelia. And then Shakespeare, kind of sucking on his quill, kind of goes, that's a good name. I'll make a note of that. Or was it the other way around that Shakespeare said, yeah, I've got this really good name for a character in my play. And they went, oh, Cordelia, we're going to call our daughter that. We don't know, but it's an interesting speculation. I can also say that Shakespeare is still overlooking the scene because the large tower block towards the left-hand side in the background of this picture is part of the Barbican estate, and it's called Shakespeare Tower. There it is. Okay, so those are the three places that we know he lived in and around London. Only 3 in 25, 26 or 30 years or however long he was here. There must have been others, we just don't know. We do know that he only ever lodged in other people's houses. He never bought a place to live in London. So he was constantly going back to Stratford and toing and froing. But he did buy a house in London, the former Blackfriars Gatehouse, the former monastery gatehouse. But this was what I would call a buy-to-let. It was an investment because he was making good money and he wanted to keep investing. He bought land around Stratford. He bought that big house in Stratford, which he also probably lived in. But he bought this house, and the site of where that house was is now, I've pictured here, it's on the junction of St. Andrew's Hill, which is running left to right across us as we look at this picture, and then Ireland Yard, which is leading away from us. And he let it back to the man who was already living there, a man called William Ireland, who was a haberdasher, a city merchant. And the little lane leading away from us in this picture is called Ireland Yard, after William Ireland, who lived in the house that Shakespeare bought. On the left-hand side is the Cockpit Pub, very good City of London pub, by the way, if you're ever looking for a pint. And the building on the right has a plaque talking about Shakespeare's connection, as you can see there. Now, Shakespeare, it's also of interest, this transaction, because, sorry, before I get to that, I just want to tell you a bit more about Shakespeare and his success financially, because he bought this house as an investment. He had the funds to be able to do so. He spent £140 on it. As I said before, he would have made money out of being a sharer in the box office more than anything else. As a playwright, you didn't have any rights to the plays, so when they were sold on, you didn't make money for that. As an actor, we don't know too much about his acting abilities. He certainly acted. There's no record of him having taken the really big roles. He may or may not have taken some, but sharing in the box office made him money. And it's been estimated that at the peak of his earnings, which is this sort of time and a bit earlier, he was earning between £200 and £700, somewhere in that region, a year from his theatrical endeavours. So give that some sort of context. The wages of a skilled labourer, they would take between 11 and 38 years to earn that money. So, I mean, he wasn't like the super rich, but he was doing pretty well. If he could make the same money as it takes someone else 11 or 38 years to earn, he could do that in 1 year. He was doing pretty well. Okay, so yeah, so the other reason why this Blackfriars Gatehouse purchase is of interest to us today is the deed, the conveyance deed, contains one of only 6 surviving examples of Shakespeare's signature. By the way, this document, I photographed this from, again, across the yard, Guildhall Art Gallery, the Heritage Gallery. Apart from having a copy of the first folio on display, this document is on display. His signature is on the bottom left, and I promise you, that says William Shakespeare, although he wrote it in this particular example as William Shakespeare. And all of the 6 surviving examples of his signature is a slightly different spelling. So there was no standardized spelling in those days. And even someone who was writing for a living didn't standardize his own name, let alone other words. Okay, so moving on to Act 4, the first folio locations. The first folio, as I've mentioned, was the first collection of Shakespeare's plays. There were 36 of them published in this book in 1623, of which 18 had never been published before. And this book was the brainchild of 2 men called John Hemming, or Hemmings, different spellings and different pronunciations, John Hemmings and Henry Condell. Hemmings and Condell were friends and fellow actors of Shakespeare in the Chamberlain's Men and then in the King's Men. And they were both parishioners of St. Mary Aldermanbury, which is just out the window, basically. It's very close to here. The church doesn't exist anymore, but where the church used to exist, there's a rather lovely little park, and there is a bronze bust of William Shakespeare. But although there's Shakespeare on the top of this memorial, it's not really a memorial to Shakespeare himself. It's a memorial to Hemmings and Condell, who lived in the area and who had the idea to publish the first folio in 1623. So why is it important that they published this collection of 36 plays? Well, half of those, 18 of them, had never been published in any form before. Half of them. Of the half, the 18 that had been published, they'd been published in smaller, what they called quarto format, which is more of a sort of smaller pamphlet-like publication. But half of those 18, 9 of the ones that had been published were basically false texts. They were wrong. You know, they'd got big wrong versions of the text. Probably someone copied them down from a performance or from memory and just published them illegally. So they were wrong. And if that was the only record we had today of those plays, they would have been the wrong versions. So we owe a lot to these guys for coming up with the idea of publishing it. And if I just focus on the 18 that had never been published in any format before, I've got a note of them in my little book here, which has got a picture of Shakespeare on the front. I'm not going to list all 18. You can look it up on the internet as easily as anybody. But it's not just a bunch of lesser-known Shakespeare plays. Such absolutely vital elements of the English theatrical canon as The Tempest, The Comedy of Errors, As You Like It, Twelfth Night, Julius Caesar, Macbeth from which I quoted at the beginning, Antony and Cleopatra, Measure for Measure, All's Well That Ends Well. Some very, very significant Shakespeare plays we would not know at all if it wasn't for the publication of the first folio. And for those, I'm assuming that people that are here and online are kind of fans of Shakespeare's plays, but even if you're not interested in Shakespeare's plays, some people actually don't like them. I know it's unbelievable, but it's true, some people don't. The amount of vocabulary and phrases that comes from Shakespeare, you don't even realize you're speaking Shakespeare half the time. It is estimated, I just want to get these numbers right, it's estimated that in the region of 2,000 words were coined for the first time in Shakespeare's plays. It doesn't necessarily mean he invented them, but that's the first written record of those words. He was particularly fond of words beginning in un, so untie, unhand, unbuckle, you can come up with lots of them, 300 or so of those words he used for the first time. He also came up with a lot of phrases that we just use all the time in day-to-day life. And who knew that these all come from Shakespeare? These are just from the plays that were published for the first time in the first folio. I'm not going to read all of the ones I've written down here, but a few of them. What's done is done. That comes from Macbeth. Break the ice. I mean, that's just a totally everyday phrase, isn't it? To break the ice comes from Taming of the Shrew. Brave New World from The Tempest. A certain author got a whole career out of that phrase, didn't he? A Charmed Life, again from Macbeth. The Dogs of War, Julius Caesar. Fair Play. Fair Play, well, that comes from The Tempest and a number of others. Faint-Hearted, For Goodness Sake. I mean, for goodness sake, that comes from Shakespeare. Who would have thought? And one of my favorite ones, you can participate in this one. If I say knock knock, that comes from Macbeth. So there you go. All of a sudden, Taming of the Shrew. There are many more. So our language and vocabulary is enriched by him. And I meant to say this just now, but about 3,000 plays are known to have been written in what they call the golden age of Elizabethan and Jacobean theatre. So from roughly the 1640s from the 1560s to the 1640s. Roughly 3,000 titles are known because there's a record of the title. 80% of them we only know by the title because there is no text that survived. And during Shakespeare's lifetime, only 230 full play texts exist from plays that were written in that time, of which 38 are Shakespeare. So again, Hemmings and Condell, without them, we would really not know so much about Shakespeare as we do. Now, looking at time, let's actually move on a bit. They didn't do this by themselves at all. They needed other people involved. Some of the rights to plays had been bought up by other people. They needed those people to get involved. And of course, they needed printers and booksellers. These guys were actors. They did not have the means to do the whole thing by themselves. So a syndicate was formed to produce the first folio. And the two lead members of the syndicate had to go to Stationers' Hall to register the rights of the plays that they didn't already own as a syndicate. Stationers' Hall was very close to St. Paul's Cathedral, as it is today, on Ave Maria Lane, just at the end of Paternoster Row. And that Stationers' Hall today That building actually dates from 1673. So the building that stood in Shakespeare's day had been in this location since 1606, so in Shakespeare's time. That burnt down in the Great Fire. So the one that we see today is from after the Great Fire, with extensions that have been built since then. Stationers, they had a very important and powerful role by the time of Shakespeare. This is one of the city's livery companies or trade guilds, and they were originally formed in the early 1400s as a merger between booksellers and limners. Limners were people that used to illustrate books. That was in the days when all books were copied by hand. By the 1500s, printing is the prime form of copying and therefore creating books to sell. And in 1555-ish, Queen Mary gave them a monopoly, effectively. So every book that was published could only be published, printers and publishers were all members of the stationers, could only be done by members of the stationers company. If you were not a member of the stationers company, you could not print or publish a book. And she also required that every title had to be registered on the stationers register at Stationers Hall. She was actually doing this primarily because if you recall from your English history, she was the Catholic daughter of King Henry. The country had been through a period of arch Protestantism under Edward VI, and then she'd taken it back to Catholicism. And she was a bit worried that there was anti-Catholic literature being published. So she said, right, if I know every title of every book that's published, I can keep an eye on this. So that's the start of it. But by Shakespeare's day, it was nothing to do with that. It was just a great monopoly for members of the Stationers Company. Mm-hmm. So the two leading members of the syndicate publishing the first folio on the 8th of November, 1623, so last month, about 6 weeks ago, last month, 400 years ago, they went to Stationers Hall to register the titles of Shakespeare's plays that were going into the first folio, those that they didn't already as a syndicate have the rights to. They registered them. And this picture on the right of the slide is, I took it when I went into Stationers Hall on open house weekend. You can't normally go in there unless you're a member, but I went for open house weekend and they've got an image of it on the wall. This is my image of their image. I've taken this photo of their image of the page. And blowing it up, you can see at the top of the page, date 8th of November, 1623, and then a bit further down after some details of another entry. On the left-hand side, the name Mr. Edward Blount, E. Blount, who was a bookseller, the leading kind of bookseller member of the syndicate, and Isaac Jaggard, who was the leading printer in the syndicate. And then in the middle on the right there, it says Mr. William Shakespeare's Comedies, Histories and Tragedies, which was the official name of the first folio. And then the plays they were registering grouped into those categories are shown there too. Okay, so then the book had to be printed, and it was printed by Isaac Jaggard, his business at the Sign of the Half Eagle. He actually had been in partnership with his father, William Jaggard, but sadly William Jaggard died shortly before they registered the first folio at Stationers Hall. So Isaac took over the business and also as the City of London's official printer. And that's their workshop or their print shop was on the street that was then called Barbican, that today is Beach Street, which runs under the Barbican Centre. And that's Beach Street today. And the building on the right-hand side, very close to there, is the Shakespeare Tower that I referred to earlier on. So then it's been published, it's been printed, it needs to be sold. And the place for bookselling was St. Paul's Churchyard. For hundreds of years, St. Paul's Churchyard and Paternoster Row nearby was the centre of the bookselling trade, actually up until World War II, when World War II bombs destroyed a lot of the publishing houses and they never returned. But St. Paul's Cathedral of Shakespeare's time would have looked like this picture on the left. And this, by the way, is from the virtual St. Paul's Cathedral project created by NC State University. Go online and you can look at this project. It's absolutely incredible, these 3D reconstructions of St. Paul's in the 1620s. You can kind of zoom around. It's all, you can go inside the cathedral, you can hear the bells, you can hear a service. It's an amazing project. So this gives us an idea of, from slightly higher up, of the churchyard area around Paul's Cross. Paul's Cross is that little outdoor covered pulpit from which sermons were preached. And sermons, of course, are on religious matter, but for a long time, religious and political matters were quite closely entwined. So this was a place to come and hear sometimes quite stirring or controversial speeches. And over the centuries, there were many examples of crowds being whipped up into a frenzy by preachers at Paul's Cross. And again, the kind of themes that come through in a lot of Shakespeare's plays, a lot of themes, a lot of scenes of mobs being worked up. So whether anything quite so violent happened when he was there, the idea of it would have certainly been there. It was also a place where people just met. People met in the church, in the cathedral itself, and in the churchyard. Merchants met to do business. People met to gossip. People met. There was news flow from other countries because of all the book selling going on. And it was a place to get ideas, therefore, for your plays if you were a budding playwright. It was a place where your plays would have been sold in the quarto format if you were William Shakespeare. In the early years, they were published without his name on. And then by the time he was actually quite well known, they put his name on it because that helped to sell them in these quarto publications. Now, the first copies of the first folio sold at Edward Blount's bookshop. This is looking from within the churchyard. The houses that surrounded the churchyard created a kind of wall around it, and there were a few places you could get through between gaps in the houses as a gateway. And by this time, by the time of Shakespeare's day, most of the houses in the St. Paul's Cross end of the churchyard were occupied by booksellers. They lived in the house and they had a shop on the ground floor. And Edward Blount's shop was probably roughly where this tree is today. So one of these kinds of houses as stood in those days, that tree in the centre of the 2020s picture, I estimate is roughly where Edward Blount sold the first copies of the first folio. There was a print run, well, no one knows exactly, but it is conjectured that the print run was about 750 copies. There remain today 235 in existence, of which one you can see the other side of Guildhall Yard in the art gallery today. And they were 900 pages, and they sold for 15 shillings unbound. If you wanted a bound copy, you could pick one up for £1. For those of you who don't know, there were 20 shillings in £1. So 15 shillings was £0.75 of £1. 15 shillings, by the way, if you were a skilled labourer, I've estimated, based on various calculations, it would take you between 2 weeks and 2 months to earn 15 shillings. So this was not a publication, that could be afforded by the majority of people. It was very much for the upper end of the market, if you like. It was only the second time a collection of plays had been published in folio format. That's the full page rather than the quarto format, where you fold the page more times and it's a smaller book. The playwright Ben Jonson had a collection published, but this was by far the biggest. It had a lot more plays in it, Shakespeare as well. So it's very prestigious and aiming at the top end of the market, as I say. Okay, I'm going to whiz through because we're coming close to an hour and I'm supposed to finish. So a few places where we can see his image. The image that we know of Shakespeare today is based on the first folio portrait shown on the left, but that was published after he died, although there is an attestation by the poet Ben Jonson saying, this does look like Shakespeare, honest. There's the funerary monument at Holy Trinity Church in Stratford in the centre there, which is a sculpture. It's been described by a critic in the 20th century as making him look like a self-satisfied pork butcher. Pevsner, the architectural historian and critic, said more of a self-satisfied teacher. But it's not the most flattering picture, but it is reckoned that possibly Shakespeare commissioned it himself before he died, so maybe it's a good likeness, but maybe not, we don't know. The more compelling portrait, the one on the right, the so-called Chandos portrait, we don't know that this is Shakespeare at all, but he looks a bit more raffish, a bit more poetic. He's got an earring and he looks kind of cool. So we want him to look like that, although strangely in the Victorian period, they thought our national poet couldn't have looked that foreign, so they didn't like it at all in those days. Anyway, so where can we see him? Guildhall Yard, I've mentioned. St Mary Alderman, Bury Garden round the corner, I've mentioned. Stationers' Hall, there's a nice stained glass window if you can get inside to look at it. If you can't get inside to look at it, stand in the courtyard outside and peer through and you can see him gleaming at you from the other side. The theatre site, I mentioned this earlier on up in Shoreditch, a new statue by Raphael MacLuth, assisted by Hayley Gibbs. At the original Globe site, there's that relief on the sign outside the original Globe. St Helens Bishopsgate, a window commemorating him. Southwark Cathedral, rather sort of languid-looking statue commemorating him. By the way, Shakespeare's brother was buried in Southwark Cathedral as well. Bankside, this sort of graffiti artist called Jimmy Sees created that one, clearly based on the Chandos portrait. And Golden Lane Estate, very close to where the first folio was published in the Barbican. There's a pub called the Shakespeare. It's got this tiny little bust of Shakespeare on the wall. British Library copy of the book, but also when you go into the lobby of the British Library, there's this 18th century statue of Shakespeare, which was commissioned by the actor-manager David Garrick, who helped to repopularize Shakespeare in the 18th century. And on the former City of London building, former City of London school building near Blackfriars Bridge. Okay, so a few other places before I stop, because I really am overrunning now. Shakespeare window in Southwark Cathedral with scenes from and characters from his plays. The Boar's Head, it's actually a former factory building, now an office building, but refers to a genuine tavern which existed, which was where he set characters like Prince Hal and John Falstaff in the Henry IV plays. And BT has a building on Queen Victoria Street, Brutalist building, with this statue in aluminium, The Seven Ages of Man, by an artist called Richard Kindersley, which is reference to the All the World's a Stage speech from As You Like It and the Seven Ages as you get older. A letter that's the only surviving letter to Shakespeare that still exists today that was written to him. There's a plaque on Carter Lane referring to that. And the Great Wardrobe, also off Carter Lane. This was a great department of state where not only clothes, but all kinds of household effects belonging to the kings and queens were kept until it was destroyed in the Great Fire of 1666. But in 1604, when the coronation procession took place of King James, delayed from the year earlier because of plague the year earlier, as members of the royal household, the king's men were members of the royal household, they were each issued with 4.5 yards of scarlet cloth with which to make a livery for the procession. And as I said at the beginning, Shakespeare's name was listed at the top of the list of the players. So he's in the top company and he's the top man listed in the top company. James was very keen on them. As I said, he gave them royal patronage. But in the 10 years before King James, they appeared at Queen Elizabeth's court on average 3 times a year, not bad. The 10 years after King James came to the throne, the king's men appeared at court performing 13 times a year on average, more than all the other London companies put together. So they really were doing very well. And just to finish with, as Ben Jonson said in his poem for the first folio, he was not of an age, but for all time. So thank you very much. I'm going to leave you with a quick advert for my next walk.